Triumphalist mosques. Anybody heard about this one at Ground Zero? We'll probably talk a little bit more about that, but that's an example in the Islamic center that it became when it wasn't a mosque anymore. You know, it was Cordoba House until people realized that Cordoba means a place where they built a triumphalist mosque in Spain, and then it became Park 51, kind of a disco theme, you know? And an Islamic center with swimming pools and basketball courts and other things. I learned actually Friday for the first time that Islamic Center under the strategic plan of the Muslim Brotherhood is a place that, yeah, it's got kindergartens and it's got athletic facilities and of course it's got a mosque. It's also where you are supposed to train battalions. How's that for bridge building? And interestingly enough, bridge building, Sayyid Qutb, one of the leading ideologues of the Brotherhood movement, had a turn of phrase in his very influential book, Milestones, in which he said about bridges, the chasm between, this is a paraphrase, but it's close, the chasm between the believers and the infidels is so vast, it can never be bridged, except for the purpose of bringing the unbelievers to Islam. So whenever you hear Faisal Abdul Rauf, the imam at this Ground Zero mosque, or probably mosques in this community or elsewhere, talk about bridge building, your antenna ought to go up. That's in the context, very much a sign of Brotherhood influenced taqiyya, they call it. A great tradition within this stealth jihad line for the faith. Talk about bridge building when in fact what you really are intending to do is dawah, convert, bring people to the faith. Oh, here's one of my personal favorites. Do you remember hearing about this? This was a couple of years ago now. In Minnesota, Minneapolis, ever tolerant, the Somali cabbies decided that they didn't want to have impure people in their back seat, like blind people who might have seeing eye dogs, or people carrying alcohol, because that's haram, impure. Can you imagine turning away blind people in a liberal state like Minnesota, most especially? This gives rise to this next slide, a cartoon. Shariah the taxi. You know, don't even think about bringing that constitution into the back seat. These are little concessions, unless you think about them as very symbolic indicators of what the guys who are promoting Sharia are seeking to secure from the rest of us. Submission. Right? Mm-hmm. The literal meaning of the word Islam is submission. Mm-hmm. And that's what Sharia is all about. Next slide. Sharia compliant finance. I think actually this is probably the single most insidious of the forms of stealth jihadi techniques. Why? Because it enables them to get right in the central bloodstream of American capitalism. And again, most of us don't even know what's happening. Let me give you some examples. What is it, first of all? Well, most people who know anything about it will tell you it's, it's just kind of like socially responsible investing. You know, Catholics do it, Jews do it, Baptists do it. This is really basically the same thing. It just means that you can't have any interest, neither charged nor paid. Well, how many of you actually think there's a financial transaction, certainly in a capitalist system, that doesn't involve the time value of money being recognized in some way? Well, duh, of course. So what they do is they find ways to pay interest but call it something else. There's ownership and there's deferred payments and so on. Yeah, of course, it's not supposed to involve pork or gambling or tobacco or alcohol or pornography, which can be a number of things, or Western defense. It's okay to have Muslim defense, mind you, but not Western defense. But who actually makes these determinations? Well, there's Sharia authorities. In every case, if you're, say, Goldman Sachs, or Merrill Lynch, or the Federal Reserve Board, you have to get yourself a Sharia advisor to tell you whether that transaction is actually halal, pure, or haram, impure. Well, guess what, folks? Remember going back to the technique about insinuating people who can exercise influence? What could be better than having guys who are actually deeply, deeply invested in the Sharia program, telling American capitalists how their capital and credit flows have to be managed, especially if it's money coming from places like Saudi Arabia, as Newt was talking about, or for that matter, other Gulf states, Malaysia, what have you. So you get guys, I mean, I'm sort of an old Cold War guy, as you heard from my resume. I think about it this way, going back to the Cold War, going back to Team B1. Imagine if in the height of the Cold War, American capitalism took into its ranks at basically board level, which is where these characters operate, KGB agents. Do you think it would have worked out? Certainly the way it did, I dare say not. Just two examples of prominent Sharia advisors you never heard of. Taqi Usmani. He formerly was the head of the Dow Jones Islamic Index. Did you know there was a Dow Jones Islamic Index? For years. We outed Taqi Usmani with the Dow Jones people by pointing out that this guy has an entire chapter of a book helpfully published in English in which he tells his constituency that they must engage in violent jihad. Even in countries like this where they are allowed to practice dawah, the stealthy kind, to their heart's content. That was a little sticky for Dow Jones, so they threw him over the side, but he's still on any number of boards, still calling the shots as to where the money goes. As is Youssef al-Qaradawi. Anybody heard of Youssef al-Qaradawi? You're obviously not watching your Al Jazeera, are you? He has his own program, which has become one of the go-to vehicles for the Muslim Brotherhood to be pumping out its jihadist propaganda. He's actually called Sharia-compliant finance, jihad with money. Kind of a clue, don't you think? Let me just introduce this term, zakat, because this is one of the particularly worrying things. Not only is there that business about where the investments go or don't go, who will get the money, the credit, who won't, but you also have this business of zakat. Zakat is tithing in the tradition of Islam. And there are 8 activities that you can use to justify your tithing, to have it count, I guess is the way to put it. One of which is explicitly supporting jihad. 3 others are sort of supporting those who engage in it, like, the families of martyrs, for example. Now, what Qaradawi and Usmani and their friends are doing is they're skimming off a piece of the proceeds of these Sharia-compliant transactions, and they're just channeling them to their favorite charities. And you'll be surprised to know they're not the Red Cross and the American, United Way. They're jihadist operations. Interestingly enough, President Obama, when he was in Cairo, made as one of his professions of his commitment to try to help improve Muslim-American relations the statement that he wanted to eliminate the impediments to the practice of zakat. Now, Andy McCarthy, one of the guys I mentioned who's a Team B member and brilliant, prosecutor, said, The only impediment to zakat I can think of is the prohibition on material support for terrorism. So is the president proposing to get rid of that? Well, there's some evidence that he actually is. Next slide. Oh, by the way, did I mention this? These letters familiar? That's good, you own them.
Right.
80% of them. This happens to be the largest purveyor of Sharia-compliant insurance products in the world. In fact, colleagues of mine have a federal lawsuit going against these guys up here in Michigan. Not against these guys, against the federal government, on the grounds that it is a violation of the constitutional separation of church and state for us to own people who are promoting religious products. In the course of the discovery, interestingly, we've established that at over $1 billion of your money in their bailout went directly to the Sharia-compliant insurance division of AIG. Next slide. Okay, moving right along. Blasphemy and slander, I sort of touched on this before. It's of a piece with that stuff that I showed you at the beginning about the disappearing language. The reason the language has to disappear is because it's not compatible with Sharia's prohibition on blasphemy and slander, to say anything that gives offense to Muslims. Now, let me show the next slide on this one. You may never have heard of this outfit either, but please pay attention to it because it's a coming problem, big time. It's called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, or OIC. 57 member states, well, they count Palestine in a little prematurely, but not by much, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a moment. They've had a 10-year plan, they're about 5 years into it now, to ensure that none of us give offense to Islam. The vehicle that they've chosen to do it, because they've established themselves as a very powerful, in fact, by far the most powerful bloc within the United Nations, is to get the United Nations Human Rights Council. Have you heard of these guys? I mean, this is the ultimate oxymoron. Iran, Libya, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and the boys think what the Human Rights Council ought to do is get all of the United Nations member states to agree to prohibit, through their own domestic legislation, prohibit and criminalize expression that gives offense to Muslims. Anybody heard of the Second Amendment? Second Amendment is kind of a problem because the United States government, September a year ago, co-sponsored a slightly watered-down version of that same resolution. So, next slide. And I'll close with this. Insinuating Sharia into U.S. courts. In that speech that Newt Gingrich gave, which I commend to you, in September of this year at the American Enterprise Institute, he made a special point of calling out a state judge. I know a gentleman here, federal judge, just retired, will appreciate this particularly. A state judge up in New Jersey, a political appointee in fairness, but nonetheless, a state judge ruled in a court case brought by a woman, Muslim woman, on the grounds that she needed a restraining order from her husband, who was systematically raping and torturing her. And the judge in the case ruled against her, refused to issue that order on the grounds that he bought her husband's argument that he was just practicing his faith. He was practicing Sharia, which says he can do anything he wants to his wife. Never mind the laws of the United States of America.